Thank you all for coming and for joining us this evening to have this important conversation. It's very difficult to mark what it is that the context of our conversation tonight. It's been 166 days of absolute warfare, siege, genocidal campaign against Palestinians in Gaza that began, today is, what time is it now? It's like 10 to 6. Between the afternoon yesterday of 12 p.m. and today at 12 p.m., according to the Ministry of Health, 104 Palestinians were killed and 162 Palestinians were injured. Between October 8th, 2023 and noon today, at least 31,923 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza and 74,000 Palestinians have been injured in Gaza. At least of these deaths, 13,000 children. In January, the killing rate was estimated at 250 a day. Palestinians were being killed, and one Palestinian child was being killed every 10 minutes. Now, we're here for about 2 hours, maybe an hour and a half together. And in that time, about 4 to 5 Palestinians will be killed by the hour, so about 6 will be dead by the time we end today. 4.5% of the entire population of the Gaza Strip is dead, missing, or injured. 70% of the Gaza Strip's infrastructure is destroyed. 1.7 million people are displaced. And now we are witnessing a man-made famine that will only accelerate. And it's incredibly difficult, I know it's very hard with the scale of violence and with reckoning with the complicity of the United States, which is where we are today, and the reality that this is an American war, an American genocide. We all feel helpless. I want to acknowledge that. I feel helpless and I feel hollow almost every day. But at the very least, we can hold on to the spaces that we still have. And for now, that includes our university. So at this time when everything feels useless, what we are trying to do here on campus, students, faculty, staff, keep a space, however, it's like a window closing every day. But this space is incredibly important, and what we do to keep the conversation on Palestine and to keep centering Palestine and Palestinians at Rutgers University is incredibly important work, and I thank you all for coming, whether you're here online or in person. Also, thank you. So my name is Mikdashi. I'm an associate professor here at Rutgers in the Department of Gender Studies, and I'm also the director for the Center for Middle East Studies. And we're really proud to have this event with somebody who I have learned so much from, and someone who we have immense respect for. And I want to thank our co-sponsors in helping us bring Nadine, the Department of American Studies, Department of Gender Studies, and the Afterlives of Liberation Mellon Sawyer Seminar. I've printed out some stats for today, if anyone is. This is the UN OCHA chart as of today that lists Israeli and Palestinian casualties. Nadine Naber is a professor in the Gender and Women's Studies program and the Global Asian Studies Program and the Department of Anthropology at the University of Illinois, Chicago. At UIC, she is the co-PI of the Middle East and Muslim Societies Cluster and co-organizer of the Global Middle East Studies Working Group. She is the author, co-editor of 5 books, including Arab America, Gender, Cultural Politics, and Activism. And I've taught this book in our department, and it's always really creates important conversations around ethnic studies frameworks, ethnography among immigrant I mean, it's a great book. Anyway, read it, teach it. It's a great book. That was 2012. Race and Arab Americans, 2008. Filing and Erasure, Cultifying Strong and Vibrant Arab American Communities in Chicagoland, 2022, and The Paradox of Social Development in the Arab Region for the United Nations in 2015. Nadine is the recipient of several awards, major awards, such as the 2022 Lifetime Achievement Prize from the American Studies Association, the 2002 YWCA's Y Women's Leadership Award, and the 2021 Andrew Mellon Humanities Without Walls Award. Nadine Naber, Dr. Naber, is the co-founder of Arab and Muslim American Studies at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and she was also the faculty founder, former director of the Arab American Cultural Center at UIC. And this is something I'm definitely gonna ask your help on how you did all that. She is currently writing a book titled Pedagogies of the Radical Mother and a book titled Social Movement-Led Research Methodologies. She's on the editorial board of JPS, Journal of Palestine Studies, and serves on the boards of organizations such as the Arab American Action Network, Shabaka, the National Council for Arab Americans, and the Feminist Peace Initiative. Please welcome me in. I
can't talk anymore.
Yeah, it's very difficult to speak today. And the way this is going to run, we're going to have, Nadine will have a short presentation, then we will have a couple of questions to have a conversation about, and then we're going to open it up to questions. Iftar is, I think, 7:10, right? So there will be food arriving at around 6:30. We're going to try not to put it in here. We'll try to put it out there, keep it out there. All right.
Thank you so much, Maya. Thanks to all the organizers. It's such an honor to be here. And I have to admit, I'm intimidated by Maya because I think she's so brilliant. I've learned so much from her over the years, and it's such an honor to be sharing this conversation with you. I'm scared of your questions, though. Yeah, thanks, everyone. Well, as you knew from the intro, I was an activist in a way before I was an academic. So I come to this topic as a diasporic Arab activist, feminist, as well as a scholar of U.S. feminist of color social movements and Arab American, connecting Arab and Arab American activist movements. So I'm somewhat presenting in a bit of a teach-in style, you could say, given that we're working to end genocide, leaving no moment uninterrupted by our efforts. So in that spirit, I'll just dive in. I'm going to be feminist framework, you could say, for our activist work. While it is well established, especially out of Indigenous studies from scholars like Sarah Deer and Jennifer Dennett-Dale, that sexual violence is a tool of colonization. And this is a hugest trigger warning for a great deal of my talk. Indeed, the practices of rape and sexual assault that have been well documented during the founding of Israel that continue today are not an exception or a secondary impact of colonial violence, but are part of the settler colonial white supremacist logics and practices of Israel that conflate colonized women with the land and nature and assume that therefore to dominate the land necessitates dominating Palestinian women's bodies and their reproductive capacities from 1948 until today. Of the nearly 70 massacres during the 1948 Nakba, Deir Yassin was one of these atrocities, where Israel enacted destruction, pillaging, rape, and displacement, just as we are seeing today in Gaza. Then and now, dismemberment, destruction, theft, killing, burning, and entrapping bodies, and rape have been permeable relationalities within the Zionist project. And continuing over the years since 48 at checkpoints, in the raids of Palestinian homes, and within the more central sites that we see in terms of Israeli sexual assault against Palestinians in the Israeli prison system. Not only are these enactments of sexual violence crucial decolonial feminist concerns, but they also reinforce and reproduce anti-Arab and anti-Muslim racism as a strategy to turn attention away from Israeli sexualized torture. Let me explain what I mean by that. And I'm going to do that by referring to the case of our beloved Rasmiyah Aoudeh, who was deported, a Palestinian activist leader who was deported from Chicago in 2017. In her court case, she was a political prisoner. She was incarcerated in an Israeli jail after she was coerced into a confession through sexualized torture in 1969 for a bombing. And after spending 10 years in prison, she was deported from her homeland. She lived in Chicago for 20 years and built her life and community. And then the US, relying on 500 pages of military documents from the Israeli courts, deported her to Jordan. In her case, we learned about the pattern of using racist, colonial, sexist discourse. We learned about how Israel uses racist discourse about Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims in their sexualized torture. So let me explain. There is this racist assumption that Arab culture is hyper-misogynist and rooted in apparently backwards or savage concepts of family honor and shame. In one well-established pattern, Israeli soldiers threaten Palestinian detainees, but they will bring in a family member to watch the soldiers sexually assault them or punish them by sexually assaulting their family member. Indeed, Nada Ilya has documented Israeli military intelligence officer, more recently, Mordechai Khadar, suggesting that the only thing that would deter attacks by a Hamas militant is knowing that if caught, his sister or his mother would be raped. This colonial strategy is driven by a racist idea that sexualized punishment is a special way to punish people from the Arab region. As this colonialist racist logic goes, since the many people often lumped together as Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims are considered exceptionally sexist, sexual violence is then deemed especially appalling to them. Of course, US soldiers used a similar logic against Iraqi war prisoners in a US prison. But I want to ask us, like my co-struggler Trishala Deb asks when she wrote about Abu Ghraib, for which culture would these acts of sexual assault, rape, and murder be less appalling? Today in Gaza, the UN has uncovered sexual assault, rape, and threats of rape, including Israelis taking and uploading photos of female detainees in degrading circumstances, borrowing again from the US in Iraq. And again reinforcing that sexual shaming of Arabs is an exceptionally viable strategy of torture and dehumanization against them. And in fact, I was having a conversation with Dr. Asla yesterday, and I learned a great deal from her. So I think you should give a talk soon because you expanded my analysis on this, this strategy. We are then witnessing this colonial strategy. What it does is it shifts the gaze around who the agents of violence are, from the colonizer to the colonized. And we've seen this since October 7th, whereby anti-Arab, anti-Muslim racism allows the long history of Israeli sexual violence against Palestinians to become invisibilized, insignificant, not worthy of outrage, compared to reports of rape by Israeli women.
Recording
as
stopped.
if it's easy to explain, as if it's easy to explain when Israeli women are raped because it's obvious, it's the savage Muslims. But when the survivors are Palestinian or people of color more broadly, courts and popular discourse invisibilize it. So we should be asked, is it only after Israelis have reported experiences of rape are the US state, corporate media, and Zionists the world over finally wanting to talk about sexualized violence in Palestine? If we really want to end gender violence, we must all at once stand against all instances of sexualized violence, while simultaneously refusing to be manipulated into the US and Israel's colonial feminist instrumentalization of sexualized violence to justify genocide. Israel's violent heterosexist strategies have at the least a double effect. They aim to scare Palestinian women from participating in resistance against colonization. And then again, that strategy also relies on a sexist, racist logic that if we threaten Palestinian women, Palestinian men, whose role in this racist logic is to protect their women, will then deter their women from joining the resistance. And as the US finds its perfect ally in Israel, it is no surprise then that Israeli discourse and practice can be understood as an extension of US imperial logics and histories of enslavement that continue in the prison industrial complex today, in the white supremacist necessity to punish perpetrators of violence against white women, especially if they're men, whereas white supremacists, including cops and prison guards, can perpetrate sexualized violence against Black women with impunity. So let's now talk about reproductive injustice. The Israeli state's colonial violations as part of a larger project bent on erasing, eliminating, and disappearing Palestinians necessitates the control as well as the destruction of Palestinian women's alleged reproductive capacities within its colonial logic. Palestinian women are constructed as bearers of future understand the horrific killing of Palestinian children. Long before October 7th, the long history of Palestinian feminist activist resistance to Israeli practices, we have a long history of analysis on this. The Israeli practices of blocking pregnant Palestinian women in labor at checkpoints from reaching medical facilities, denying Palestinians the right to bury their children, Israel's longstanding practice of holding captive Palestinian children's bodies in cemeteries or freezers also entails a form of psychological torture, leaving Palestinian family members to wonder, sometimes for decades, whether their child is even really dead. And we are seeing that now. And now in Gaza, as Palestinian Lama Roche recently wrote, pregnant Palestinian mothers are frantically running around the house, startled by sounds of missiles, wondering if their babies are still alive. And I won't even read the rest of the quote because it's just a lot to hold all of this talk all at once. Here, Israel targets mothering and caregiving, positioning Palestinian mothers and caregivers in a dual struggle to protect themselves from the same state apparatus from which they are fighting to protect their loved ones. And as we have learned from Indigenous feminist scholars like Dion Millian, Luana Ross, Joanne Barker, on Turtle Island about the settler colonial strategy of forced family separations, like the kidnapping of Indigenous children into residential schools. And we've also learned from Black feminist research on enslavement and policing from scholars like Andrea Ritchie, Dorothy Roberts, and Angela Davis, that the practice of separating family members from each other and people from their loved ones is a carceral and imperial strategy. In Palestine, Israeli settler colonialism depends on separating children from their parents and caregivers, denying mothers and caregivers the capacity That, of course, with the border wall, Jewish-only roads, incarceration, displacement, but also Israel's long history of intentionally shooting and bombing children with the intention to kill, a strategy consolidated during the Second Intifada in 2000, which devastates mothering and caregiving. I mean, I guess in a way I was thinking about this before the talk, you know, when we say like Palestine is a feminist issue, I still haven't figured out how to say this, but it might be flipped. It's not just that Palestine is a feminist issue, it's that we can't struggle to free Palestine without feminism, meaning that these issues are integral to colonization. So if we're trying to work to end genocide and colonization, we can't ignore them. Beyond those children Israel has now killed, there are an unknown number of Palestinian women and children, including girls, who have gone missing. And that is right now in Gaza, the reports on this of children separated from their parents, as we know, so many people whose whereabouts remain unknown. And compounding all of this, Israel covers up these reproductive injustices through mother shaming, which scapegoats Palestinian mothers as if they are responsible for military violence and killing, to shift the gaze away from the Israeli state's horrific gender and sexualized violence. For example, in the Israeli Minister of Interior, Eilat Shaked, who openly called for the murder of Palestinian women because they give birth to little snakes. And historically, there's been a lot of analysis and documentation by Palestinian feminists on these racist depictions of Palestinian mothering in terms of like being bad mothers who throw their children out to the streets to die, mothers who raise terrorists, which echoes and mirrors what we see with the carceral system today in the United States, right, of blaming Black mothers for gun violence, et cetera. And now let's talk about homophobia and transphobia. Many of us are already familiar with pinkwashing, whereby how many of you are familiar with pinkwashing? Raise your hand. Okay, so since some of us aren't, I'll explain it. The Israeli state claims to be the only safe haven for LGBTQ people in the region, in contrast with Palestine, where it is implied is the most homophobic place on planet Earth. Pinkwashing, like colonial feminism, turns attention away from Israeli state violence and places it on savage Palestinian culture and religion, which also erases the existence of queer and trans Palestinians. As I speak, Israel and US pundits of pinkwashing are launching online campaigns promoting condemnation of Hamas's persecution of LGBTQ people in Gaza. In a racist analysis that can only address violence in the MENA region through abstract notions of culture and religion, like, the only explanation there is for any form of violence in the region is the culture or the religion. So these are like ahistorical Orientalist, ideas that give like this timeless explanation of violence. Like they are violent because they are Arab or Muslim. So these campaigns, adopt that. They're crying out about how Hamas equals death for queer people while obscuring that rape and death are what Zionists are enacting on queers and women who stand with Palestine, as well as the historical and political realities of Israeli genocidal killing of Palestinians, including queer and trans people. In addition, by recruiting queer and trans Palestinians as poster children for its propaganda, or threatening to out them to their families if they do not collaborate with Israel as spies, this Israeli state further marginalizes queer Palestinians by equating queerness with collaboration and normalization, placing queerness outside the boundaries of a decolonized free Palestine. And on this topic of homophobic and transphobic colonial violence, these discourses trickle down into Zionist attacks on Palestinian and all Swana diasporas in the US who are Palestine activists. What we have seen is that women, but even more disproportionately, queer and trans activists, we are seeing so many people rising up right now against doxing, against criminalization, against repression of activism, the attacks on academic freedom on our campuses. A lot of us are working on that and talking about it and standing up against it, but we're not talking enough about the disproportionate impact, disproportionate danger that such doxing and repression has for queer and trans activists. And what I mean by that is that, you know, these threats can be highly gendered and sexualized, and they're laced with homophobic and transphobic language, as well as calls for sexual violence and rape. But before I go on with that, I just want to put it out that, you know, we used to say like attack, these are, you know, when someone says, oh, you're speaking up about Palestine, you're anti-Semitic, or you're, you know, terrorist supporter, we used to call these attacks on free speech. But I think we need to change our language and refer to them as, you know, I don't have a term yet, but we can discuss it. I mean, these are dangerous attacks. They're putting people into context of criminalization, of arrest, and even death. In Chicago, a 6-year-old boy was stabbed 26 times by his landlord inside of his apartment building for being Palestinian. So when you go out and you say, you know, this person is a terrorist supporter, and you write it just on the internet, it can have a potentially, you know, murderous effect, as well as criminalizing effect. So I think we need to, you know, expand how we talk about this. So when we're talking about trans folks who are activists, I'll just give you some examples from some of my research, and also research that you can look all this up in websites like Palestine Legal, Center for Constitutional Rights. You know, someone will call a community center and say, is this the terrorist community center? And then I'm going to come rape you and give you a taste of your own medicine. So you often have these calls to rape integrated into the racist targeting. But now let's take it even further. When you have trans folks, for example, speaking out, queer folks who are visibly queer, you then will hear things like, you are a piece of trash, a piece of feces, an anti-Semitic C word. You are disgusting. Go live in Palestine and let them kill you there. And many calls literally for death. These examples are the invisibilized in our own movements ways Israeli settler colonial violence extends into the criminalization of Palestine activism. Even well-intended can reinforce the gender binary in speaking up against racism. So that would be like the analyses that, you know, when people say, well, how is anti-Palestinian racism gendered? So they'll say, well, men are racialized as terrorists, criminals, agents of violence. Women are stereotyped as wearing hijab, abject, voiceless beings, extensions of the terrorist, sisters or daughters of the terrorist, like, you know, connected to terrorism. Or they're victims, you know, the veil, the whole thing of veil being symbol of a backwards culture and religion. So it's like the terrorist man and the veiled women. But we really need to be careful because even in challenging racism, from a feminist perspective, we can participate in the invisibilizing of trans experiences. And there are writings by trans Palestinians in the US saying that when they walk into a woman's bathroom, they get seen as a Palestinian man terrorist, and people are scared that they might be raped by them. You know, so these are all the kinds of anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab racism that are left out when we continue to do our activism through a gender binary. These stories teach us that policing Palestinian communities, just like in the colonization of the Americas, has depended on systematic policing and punishment of gender and sexual variance. And that colonization operates through a gender binary and a demand for gender conformity. So when we're talking about this doxing and repression, it's compounded, it is a form of criminalization and punishment, but it's also a criminalization and punishment of sexual and gender nonconformity, as sexual deviants who commit crimes against nature must be harshly punished, coupled with the necessity of the gender binary in facilitating the colonial expansion of Turtle Island and Palestine. So any movement committed to a free Palestine must take seriously how the categorical dichotomization of gender and sexuality is made material, is corporalized through violence, punishment, murder, and disappearance. And that the gender binary is foundational to colonization. And also that the gender binary, like all borders, are made possible through state violence. And my last section is on, we got the time? Anti-Imperialist Abolition. So with every escalation of US wars, whether we're talking about the post-9/11 war of terror or Genocide Joe's current war on Palestine, we witness an escalation in the racist, sexist policing and the militarization of the US border. So what I'm getting into now is a framework for thinking about the interconnections between struggles here on Turtle Island and the struggle to free Palestine. And how to think about these as operating within the same like spatio-temporal location and same frame of violence, state violence and imperial violence. So the US supports Israel. So one way to think about that is also challenging us to move beyond thinking about why the US supports Israel, because oftentimes it makes sense that it has a lot to do with the US's imperial aims, its quote unquote forest policy interests in the MENA region. But it also supports Israel to maintain US systems of colonization, carcerality, policing of borders. So it's kind of like thinking about the strengthening of US global power depends on the strengthening of US borders and US carcerality within the United States. So I'm going to explain what I mean by that. So during this profoundly terrorizing moment of the Palestinian genocide, we need to acknowledge how the structures of incarceration, anti-migrant violence, and US conquest have always gone hand in hand. So let's think about the concept of abolition that many of us now use and, might be mobilized by. Carceral systems in the US emerge in the context of periods of colonial land settlement here. European colonization of Turtle Island also necessitated securing borders to strengthen the power of the US nation state. So what I'm trying to put together is securing of borders, carceral systems, and land settlement all reinforce each other. And we could just think of how the militarization of the police, for example, we often don't talk about how it's an outgrowth of the war on drugs, which was first declared by President Nixon and expanded by Reagan, and how the militarization of police was then propelled forward through the post-September 11th war on terror. That is when we started seeing an intensification of the militarization of the police. So that what I'm saying is that the US used the war on terror to justify the militarization of police. So these histories, including how many US cops are trained in Israel, helps explain why we are seeing SWAT teams evicting houseless mothers from homes where they were staying. This was, something I've written about in Oakland in 2020, where you had military grade, SWAT teams showing up to evict Black mothers from a place where they were staying with their kids, or military grade weapons used against protesters, or why a cop who arrested an Arab woman who wore hijab while she was driving pulled her over and said, "I just came back from crushing skulls in Iraq." Or why the Department of Homeland Security collected names of protesters during the 2020 protests around George Floyd. May he rest in peace. Feminist of color activists coming from an inner, so now what I'm going to do is talk about feminist of color activism that has probably been, I would say, at the forefront of making these connections, especially because feminist of color activists tend to come from an intersectional perspective that's thinking about multiplicity of oppressions and how different forms of oppression play out differently depending on the context. Many of you have studied in your classes, I'm guessing. So what I'm talking about here, I want to give some examples of social movements as a model that maybe we can look at and talk about that link struggles for immigration, related justice, decolonization of indigenous lands, Palestinian liberation, anti-war movements, and linking that and centering the struggle to end in one organizing space. I know that can sound overwhelming, like how do you build a movement that's doing all those things at once? But it can be done, and it's being done. So the analysis here then is that US imperialism, well, I don't know, for time I might skip that whole definition. Okay, let's see. I think I'll just skip this and go to that this is not a new framework. It's been around for centuries. We can even go back to, the Black radical tradition was always an internationalist tradition and linked, abolition with, anti-imperialism. I'm even thinking in the 60s and 70s, Third World Women's Alliance, if you wanted to look into this, there's a huge history of feminist organizing, coalitionally connecting Palestine, Nicaragua, Black, Asian, Latinx, Indigenous struggles here together. So I'll give an example from a movement that I'm connected to called the Insight Movement. It connects, it's a coalitional feminist movement that, maybe refers to itself as like a movement of many movements. And it assumes that organizing against sexual and intimate violence against women and queer people of color means addressing the conditions that make that violence possible, or that sexual violence is a tool of war and empire is then delivered at the hands of the military, the police, border patrol, prison guards, and schools. I've written on this with a co-author. So this comes from, I didn't just sit here and analyze a social movement for the purpose of this talk, but it's part of maybe a 10-year project. We're trying to, analyze this concept of anti-imperialist feminist abolition. And so some of that, just, in a couple notes on that would entail thinking about sexualized military violence related to, wars and carceral system and how they magnify each other. I could talk about that more if you want in a bit. I think I'll just close then with some reflections on, I was just trying to think if I should give any examples. I guess I could give one example because I was very abstract. If we think about, we think about activists, right, interested in ending war, anti-war activists. So they might go out and go, let's get people involved in our movement to end the genocide right now. Challenge, because you might only get people who show up who either have the capacity to work on that, or they might. So in other words, people who are working on other struggles like, police violence might not always have the capacity to take up another issue. So then you might end up with only certain types of people at the table. But if, let's say we were talking about, I'll give an example from the anti-war movement against the war in Iraq. In many feminist spaces, you would find that it would be Arab, Iranian, South Asian women at the table, feminists working to end the war in Iraq. And then we would say, well, why is it like this? And then we started talking about, we need to talk about how the war in Iraq is trickling down in the lives of communities of color in the US. So how do wars trickle down? They trickle down in many ways. We talked about militarization of the police as a recent phenomena, but also we could think about the resources, obviously, being taken from our schools and put into the military. We could think about times of intensified war are times also that inspire sexualized violence and domestic violence, all across the US. And then we could also think about military recruitment, right? Who gets recruited to the military? It's working class people of color. Who is positioned as fodder on the front lines of US wars? It's working class people of color. And then there's the question of sexualized violence in the military that disproportionately affects, women of color, queer and trans people of color more than anyone else. So these are all examples of how you could, talking about war as a issue affecting all of our communities. So then, for example, rather than coming up with a campaign per se about the impact of the war in Iraq on people in Iraq, it would entail maybe coming up with a campaign around ending military recruitment in working class schools, right? As a way to broaden the movement and also take seriously, the issues happening in our own backyard. And in a way, it's also an anti-imperialist strategy because it challenges, when you organize movements that separate the domestic and the global, you're reifying US empire. So we can talk about that more if you want. So I'm going to close with a few new reflections that I'm writing for the Institute for Palestine Studies that are somewhat inspired by our colleague Rana Barakat, who has been challenging us all to stop focusing only on, all the horrible things the U.S. and Israel have done, but also uplifting uplifting life and existence and perseverance and steadfastness, and affirming life as part of a decolonial project. So as we envision a free Palestine, we can ask ourselves, what does sustaining life look like, even during genocide? And if we're not talking about that, we're limiting our vision when it comes to, if we're thinking of a free Palestine or dismantling the US or abolishing prisons, right? We're going to need to talk about what we want, what kind of world we want to build, and start building it now. So I think these are some reflections of what I've gained from this, what I've learned about sustaining life since October 7th. And it is a reflection from practices I've learned from other people from the Swana region working together, including Maya, and how we've been mobilized by collective grief, rage, but also our innermost promise to love, sustain, and care for each other. And I've been calling this the psychic life of liberation as the communal form of knowledge and practice that activates us. And it's an unspoken psychic life grounding us in the collective power of knowing that we are not alone and that we can and must depend on one another to survive. And as we mobilize, respond, and grieve, we pick up the phone and we call each other. Amin, I heard you lost 23 family members in Gaza. May they rest in peace. Inshallah, I'll stop by later with a meal. Neda, if you're hurting too much, I'll deliver the posters to the rally for you today. How is your family in Jenin? We are here for you. We're here for anything. We understand the empire is crumbling and freeing Palestine can feel further and further away. But if we invoke the psychic life of liberation, even if it seems premature, optimistic, it is through this invocation, the stretching of language, that we reclaim the conditions of liberation's possibility. Liberation is not only a destination, it's an ongoing struggle. We must refuse to limit our visions and hopes for liberation and our futures to our reaction to Zionism. We must trace liberation's deep roots by reaching into the well of our inner communal resources, our collective histories and memories of caring for and committing to each other, even through the most violent, shocking, and gruesome atrocities. No end to fires we are forced to put out in every moment, on every campus, and everywhere right now. And these disproportionate attacks on women and our queer and trans siblings that are distinctly violent. But we are also feeding each other and reminding each other it's okay to not be okay. Don't forget to breathe and look up at the sky. We rage, we spiral, and come back to ourselves and each other. There's no respite from one part of the struggle while we attend to the other. I think I want to just wrap this up with affirming that fighting and working to keep people alive and persevere during genocide is revolutionary. And it's a refusal of the colonial language that disappears our truths in order to disappear our people. Our diasporic movements against colonization and genocide are movements for those we love, who remain alive, who we attend to. We are pledging to comfort each other in the face of brutal atrocity and abandonment. This psychic life of liberation is the embodiment of our communal languages, our intergenerational sentiments and commitments that we depend on to keep going, to stand in kinship with each other, to reach for each other for sustenance, for the strength to continue caring for one another while interrupting everything. These are insufferable times, and we cannot participate in business as usual. We must protect the psychic life of our liberation and all those who nourish and sustain it, while boldly and unapologetically backing our Palestinian, feminist, queer, and trans comrades as part of our commitment to stopping the genocide. Love and care is proof of our existence, our lives, our perseverance, and our future. To be sure, feminist and queer visions towards building towards a world without police, prisons, and war is a heart struggle and a process where over time we learn and remember the skills for living better in better and increasing harmony with one another and all life on the path to growing the irrelevance of coloniality and carcerality and ending violence. Thank you. When I walked in, and that did not help my tears. Do you want to announce that?
Nadine, Dr. Naber, Nadine was referring towards the end actually to, we have a practice on a big chat where we share pictures of the sky with each other from all around the world where we are. And it is incredibly moving to and important to remember that we are all under the same sky. In Palestine, California, New Jersey. I think we had one from where was it?
I don't know. Europe,
Serbia?
Princeton, I don't know.
Serbia.
Yeah.
And it is sometimes when we don't have words, we'll just share a picture of the sky. So thank you, Nadine. So I have a few prepared questions to move us to a different register, and maybe we'll do a couple and then open, because I think really this is a good space to just be together and think about the world we want and the world we don't want. So I'll ask sort of two questions that are around that. The first is on anti-imperialism. So in your talk today, you centered the United States, US imperialism, and US settler imperialism. Now, for sure, the United States is the most powerful imperial actor in the Middle East and North Africa. But there are other minor key actors with expansionist geopolitical goals also acting in the region, many of whom also work on this access and work on that intersection of gender, sex, political difference, the body, and availability for violence. Here I'm referring to the geopolitical expansionist goals of Iran, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. Some of these are, of course, allied to US empire, but others are not, and together they all manage the Middle East, or they manage each other's ambitions in the Middle East. What does a feminist approach to anti-imperialism look like when we think from the Middle East and all of these intersecting, some more minor than other, geopolitical goals for power, for extension, and extension through, in many ways, a focus on the body and a focus on the gendered body? And here I'm thinking all three, right? Turkey, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and Iran. Second is on abolition, and I'll ask these two together. Palestine is, the carcerality is an important structure of occupation and settlement. And you can think of just the sort of statistic that 40% of all Palestinian men have spent time in Israeli prisons. But obviously, refugee camps, status of Lebanese citizenship is a carceral structure towards Lebanese Palestinian refugees. So, and you already addressed this a little bit, but does abolition require the abolition of borders? And if so, how can we think of Palestine as a model, not for the world that we don't want, but for the future that we do want? A model for how to construct political society away from these sort of carceral structures and the heteropatriarchal tying of political difference to models of kinship. Things we've also talked about. So let's do those and then,
Yeah.
or you want to open it up? How do you want to do this? How do people feel?
Maybe
Want to just
we
open
hear
it
what
up?
people say since they might have a question.
Yes.
That I could at least write it down before they forget.
Ah, good idea. Okay.
But
Usually we have like little
What do you
note
think?
cards,
Oh, yeah.
but we don't now. So
Well, I'll ask, but I mean, I'll ask more a question of a last question. Because I was thinking, like, when you're saying about borders, I mean, it's like, I'm always thinking about the nation. And I was thinking about this in relationship to two things. One is like the relation of the nation to natality. I mean, the definition of the nation is always tied to reproduction, you know, so embedded in that is both certain kinds of gender opposition, certain kinds of assumptions about kinship structures, but also then when you were saying about like the internationalism of different kinds of liberation struggles, which seems to be the other side of it. It's like, well, if in order to get out of that particular nexus, is it necessary to, or is it advantageous to think from some space beyond the nation? And so when you were just asking that question about, you know, is Palestine a model or is it, I mean, I don't know if it's a model, but, you know, it seems to raise the, I mean, for me, it really raises the question, not just the implicit and explicit violence that subtends the nation, you know, but like, what other forms can we imagine that are more about affirming life, you know, and all of the registers that means? Because I think that seemed to be like implicit in a lot of what you were asking.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
let's take another. Mustafa, can ask a question?
Yeah.
For me, as like a student marginalizer,
Yeah.
I guess my question would be, what advice would you have for like, especially on-campus organizer of like kind of incorporating this, this specific like feminist framework within our work towards like liberation?
I love that. That's so great.
One more.
So kind of in a similar region, in terms of on-campus organizing, I feel like I've seen as as the conflict or sorry, the genocide has gone on, it's been a more female-dominated space in terms of activism, and I honestly don't understand why.
We know why.
We know.
It's a very specific topic, but in general, it's not.
Getting money.
I can give you reasons.
Thanks so much. That's really great that you asked that. It's
So
really
can we
important.
take
Yeah.
those?
Yeah.
So I would,
Frustrating. Sorry, I'm so sorry.
no, go ahead.
No, no,
You
leave it.
Oh, we were just talking like how I agree with them.
when you started speaking, I started thinking about the emotional part of it, and I didn't know how to articulate it, and I didn't know how we were dealing with it while you were talking, right? And I waited until the end when you gave me something. And that something is extremely important. I watched a movie with my student yesterday, and I left the room 3 times because I couldn't handle it. And then the 4th time I said, there is no point for me leaving. I'm going to stay here and just talk, which I did. So what I say is that the last part of your talk in which you were talking about the psychic of how did you call it? Because this is extremely important.
Psychic life of liberation.
Psychic life of liberation is a really a great like pathway to take when we are thinking about how do we feel while we are talking about actually the killing, the mass killing of anybody, but our people in particular, that has been going on for decades now, at least since we were alive, like, right, my generation. The second thought I had is, why don't you break down the term like U.S. imperialism because it hides much more. And one of the things that is hiding is capitalism.
Yeah.
Because we know that what's
Yeah.
happening in Gaza now
Exactly.
is really about dispossession, is about building new things, is about like the real estate event that were taking place in like, you know, the waterfront. And I think this is crucially important instead of speaking about this imperialism thing, that like name the beast.
Yeah,
because
that's right.
there's like capitalism there. And one of the most important moments of this deployment of the army did take place before 9/11 in the United States, and it was during the Seattle protests in 1999 against the meeting of the WTO. And that's the moment in which we saw multiple groups and multiple forces getting together to fight that thing, feminist, environmentalist. And I was thinking, which is something I shared with my own students, is that 9/11 was the event that put to rest that global movement of fighting, struggling, and fighting back against capitalism. It was 9/11 and reframing of it as terrorism and the war on terrorism. So nobody is talking about capitalism. Everybody is talking about the war on terrorism. So these connections are extremely important. The last thing I want to say is, how do you speak as an environmentalist without thinking about the war and without thinking about making spaces inhabitable to their residents? That's also another dimension of this liberation that we are seeking. Thank you.
That was so great. Yeah, to your point about imperialism, I completely agree. I actually, that was the part that I said I'm going to skip. It was right when I was defining imperialism. And I've written a lot on the interconnection between the systems on the import-export approach to like carcerality, to the technologies of war and empire, you know, like Israel testing these technologies before selling them all across the world, and how that's essential to what we're seeing now. So I really appreciate you saying that. Yeah.
So my name is Will Vargas. I'm a community-based counselor at our counseling center here in New Brunswick. And thank you so much for not only sharing of your wisdom and your knowledge and the lived experiences of those who are, right? And so for me, what is coming up as a mental health practitioner is the fact that the medical and the mental health systems are all interconnected via the systems of oppression. Not only pathologizing, but medicalizing disability along with, right, the medication industry. And so part of what I'm hoping and yearning for is that indigenous form of wellness and practice, because none of those things.
Yeah, I really appreciate you saying that. I was thinking when Zakia was talking about how it is a colonial and capitalist, racial capitalist approach to, you know, separate mind from body, body from land, people from land, humans from non-humans, you know. And so part of uplifting the psychic life of liberation is a move, you know, is a decolonial, hopefully, move to reclaim our own approach to thinking about the significance of the emotive, of the psyche, ancestral wisdoms and intergenerational trauma as all part of what we're resisting and what we're building. And how, I mean, I'll try not to, I won't go into it too much. Maybe I'll think a little bit more before I respond on that. Yeah, so thanks. I really appreciate you saying that. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's like our sensibilities, you know, our ways of being, you know, that we're not just, it goes back to moving us beyond a reactive mode and towards uplifting who we are, who we've been, and who we want to be and where we want to go, which would be integrative, collective, communal, intergenerational, ancestral, And that I was thinking about this new book that came out, The Land in Our Bones. And it's interesting because I read the book before it was published, and it's taken on a new meaning after it was written before October 7th. But, you know, it's a book that I think, you know, many people are going to be grabbing onto because it does just what we're talking about around around these questions of, yeah. So on other contexts of imperialism.
You don't have to, I mean,
Yeah.
this sounds much more interesting. The conversation we're having.
Online.
Yeah, that's
Yes.
right. That's right.
Yes, we have people.
We have people online. No questions. I mean, I'm especially interested in, you know, the organizing happening on campus. So we could also just shift to like an organizing discussion. If students or faculty want to talk through these questions, should we start with that? Like to me, the feminist question in organizing is kind of what I was saying in the beginning, that if we could think of a different framing than like Palestine is a feminist issue, what the limitation of that framework is that it implies that in addition to being, you know, an issue of decolonization or an issue of health or environment, it's also a feminist issue, you know, and that's not what it is. It's that, you know, it's that colonization depends on homophobia, transphobia, and sexualized violence, and basically depends on heteropatriarchy. Like there would be no colonialism, there would be no Zionism without heteropatriarchy.
No nation. Yeah.
No nation. And therefore, if you are striving for a free Palestine and you ignore that, you're like missing a central component of how Zionism operates. So it's kind of like saying that people who are not bringing a feminist lens are, you know, have a limited, that's not going to get us free. And it's certainly not going to get all of us free. And I think it's important to distinguish between two thoughts that both are central. One is that, so if we say Zionism depends on heteropatriarchy, that is relevant to everybody who wants to dismantle Zionism, right? It's like saying, you know, anyone who is working to free Palestine needs to tackle the sexist, you know, heteronormative demands or structures of colonization, right? Like you need to tackle all those things if you want it to be dismantled. But only doing that ignores the people and the bodies that are differently impacted by, you know, the sexist and homophobic Israeli state. And what I mean by that is it's not enough to just do the former, because we simultaneously have to then look at how these things are actually playing out materially. And when you do that, then you find that the example that I gave about the trans folks who are getting the most dangerous, harmful forms of violence. And then if you do that, then you realize we're going to need our organizing to center queer and trans people and women. Not only because they're especially vulnerable to colonial violence and the racism and the doxing, but they also embody exceptionally nuanced wisdom about Zionism because they are living it in all of its complexity. So those are the people we should be turning to for the analysis to be leading this movement. And to clarify a little bit of what I said, the first point about you can't have a free Palestine movement without a feminist and queer politics, that point or that analysis of how Zionism works, that point is kind of like maybe a Palestinian or Swana like lens or, you know, reading or analysis of how Zionism works. Like if you have a queer lens, this is how you're going to see Zionism. You're going to see it in all of its complexity. So that's one thing, is the lens like that we bring, our analysis that we bring to our movement. And then the other one isn't about your lens. It's about, you know, who are we accountable to? Who are the people, the bodies, the experiences, the survivors, you know? And so those are like two different things. And the reason I'm stressing that is because in academia, sometimes we get caught up in the first one. When we have like a queer politics, it just becomes like a reading practice or a, you know, a way of seeing the world, as if like we're going to begin and end with analyzing the state through a queer lens. But I'm saying that we need to do more.
I think there's definitely, if I can just jump in, it is definite that so two things. First, I think a lot of us have experienced, you know, a lot of us who are queer or who are women have experienced this kind of, I don't want to, like, I don't know, it's almost like it's a homophobic recitation of homophobic violence and its spectacularity. So I've been at protests where I'm then told, you know, don't you know what Hamas would do to you? Yeah. Right? If you were in Palestine. And this is, we have to start naming this actually as homophobic, right? Like you cannot rehearse violence to queer people and be like, don't you know, you would be taking, you know, and really excruciating detail. I think we have to actually shift it.
It's violent.
It's homophobic, it's violent,
Homophobic violence.
and we have to move it from thinking only in terms of pinkwashing to actually and understanding pinkwashing as a form of homophobia, actually. As a sort of
in the erasure and positioning like queer people as like abject beings, as lacking, like that you don't have your own knowledge that we're going to tell.
That's part of it, but also I think just this sort of fantasy of certain kinds of violence, of certain kinds of homophobic violence, and then the recitation of this fantasy, and at the same time, pinkwashing tells queer people like you can only care about queer issues. That's the only thing you care about. That's the only thing you are.
Issue,
right? And it fantasizes a kind of queer Arab subject, and I'm saying Arab here because pinkwashing is actually used across the region, right? The only kind of, it imagines a kind of queer person that can be uprooted without being severed, without experiencing that kind of uprooting as a kind of severing from your social structures. But I really appreciated what you said about wisdom, right? Like the knowledge of actual queer politics and queer activism, you know, just to give an example of that, up until October 6th, I was in a huge organizing with a group of queer activists in Lebanon against a queer crackdown that was happening in Lebanon. And then immediately October 8th is shifted to mutual aid order in Lebanon. 100,000 people now have been displaced. And that is just the kind of flexible knowledge that we have as organizing, and the way to organize actually away from the state, because we've always understood the state as being highly invested in us not existing. So I really appreciate that you brought that in. And, you know, I would say just part of that to the question of how we reframe the language that we're given. is to understand pinkwashing as this form of violence, as a form of homophobic violence. And then part of that is to think about the politics of how we do politics. So it's absolutely right that women and queer people have taken on the burden or have done more labor organizing. That is definitely true on this campus. It's true on many, I would say it's probably true on most campuses. But I think that then becomes the opportunity for just thinking about gendered. So it's an opening to realize that it's actually not just on this issue, it just is. When it comes to social justice work, it is a gendered labor division. And that then as working on social justice has to address the politics of how we do politics. Anyway, so
Yeah.
other rounds.
I mean, I have a lot to say about the gender and the organizing. I mean, there's a gendered logic that, especially in like diaspora communities, Noura knows because we've talked about this for so many years. I did write a book about this. Thanks. Which is around, I mean, really, I wrote a book about this. So and I have a chapter on Palestine organizing and sexism. So like, you know, if you want to read it, it would be useful. Or it like, I think not, I'm not going to say it's useful, but it validates what, you know, what people experience, I think, in their organizing. It's called Arab America and it's chapter 4. But
I have the PDF.
oh my God.
So if anyone, I can.
But I think there's layers to this question,
But you're
right?
supposed to buy the
There's one. No, you don't have to buy the book. These days, you know, don't buy the book. I'll even send you PDF. So the idea is that in diaspora communities, women become positioned as bearers of culture, of, you know, for future generations, for the community to like, you know, maintain its identity in the diaspora, you know, just to say it briefly. And then that plays out in organizing spaces because sometimes men are sort of, you know, raised to have more capacity to exist far beyond their own communities. Whereas, and this is very like gender binary, I'm being really like reductive right now, but just to get the point across, to be closer to home. You know, the whole like women will become mothers and pass on the language to their children. And that's how we're going to maintain our language in the US and all that. And so that is one factor, you know, to consider. And there are many other factors, but I think a huge one, which actually I was going to say in response to your your imperialism question, is that when the dominant discourse used against us is that we are the most sexist and homophobic people in the world, it becomes impossible to speak up about sexism and homophobia and transphobia in our communities. So it does not help the issue of how much pain, violence, devaluing, exhaustion, triple, quadruple levels of labor compared to cis men in our movements that women and queer organizers endure. It does not help that it's nearly impossible to talk about it. So one reason it's difficult to talk about is what I said, that if, you know, and I wrote about this, Noura knows, you know, we worked on this together, that if you were to say, I'm experiencing sexism in the SJP, right? It would be like, oh, there go those Palestinians again, you know, silencing women in their communities. So then no one's going to say it, you know? Or if you do say it, then you get a traitor for collaborating with Zionism, for being, you know, or for dividing the movement,
Mhm.
which we know from all the feminist of color movements in the US historically, which goes back to the civil rights movement and all the research on that. That, single issue or all the liberation movements, right? Liberation first, and then we talk about other issues. And I can add another layer, which is
Nigeria.
the idea that nothing happening in the diaspora matters when people are dying in Palestine.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Like, how dare you mention anything when, people are being killed and we just need to fight, even if that fight is super inequitable and unjust and even violent and even entails sexualized violence against women organizers. So I think all of these things can be useful for a discussion and to think about, okay, how do you talk about sexism without reinforcing Arab bashing, Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian racism? Yeah. I mean, I just think also so that was more like big analysis, but then just on a basic labor point, I'm happy you just asked the question because, and anyone else could chime in. I mean, let's just be real about what we're talking about. We're talking about this huge, division of labor issue, gender division of labor issue that's not only, which would already be so unjust, like women, and this is what is happening right now, I think. It's not the age-old gender division of labor issue where women are cooking the food for the movement and men are at the microphone, or women are being left out of decisions and men are having discussions behind closed doors and all the decisions have already been made. And all those things are still happening. But on top of it, it's that women and queer organizers are also doing the analysis and at the microphone and writing, right? So you just have this compounded forms of labor that are completely unsustainable. And so I think it's a question of supporting. How do we build movements where people are supported and no one is, it's not taken for granted that some people are just good at it or some people are better at multitasking, which is super gendered. And then everyone just sits back and I mean, I could just go on and on. I mean, the most annoying thing to me is, is the, let's just make a list. We spend the whole time asking, critiquing a plan, but not working on the plan. And I'll do a game. How many of you have experienced? Raise your hand. Number 2 is some people with privilege not paying attention to the work that's happening because they're just maybe taking a break while other people are paying attention. And then those privileged people show up and start asking about what they missed.
Yeah.
And then the people doing all the work have to then explain what's happening. How many of you experienced that? Or what time is the event? Right? And it's even that mere question, it might seem so benign, but in this moment to have to respond to a text and tell someone that the event's at 5:30 is a form of violence, in my opinion.
Right. Or being asked, and this is something myself and others have experienced on campus, faculty, that because we are Arab or Palestinian or Lebanese, that it's this weird thing where first they're like, no, you just know better.
Yeah.
You're the right
step on your
person.
toes.
You're the one who, but at the same time, first, it's a lot of time. It takes out so much. but it's also the person who would be the most vulnerable saying the same thing that other person who's like, no, you're the right person, you know? So that's something we were also experiencing. I mean, also faculty experienced this. I've experienced this definitely as no doubt. Just say it. Yeah.
And to the point of like, how do you talk about these things? Like, can you imagine if we just said, let's organize a teach-in on Zoom on sexism in the movement? Like the Zionists, it would be like the best day of their lives, you know? They would just be all over saying how like sexist we are, you know?
I think you could even tie in the fact that like this labor is unpaid. Which is really why I see a lot of like men not doing it. I don't know.
Oh, yeah. Volunteer, like women do charity work. For sure, for sure. It's not seen as important.
So I feel like with like a lot of these lists that
These lists.
Burnout obviously comes out, and I guess my question would be if you had like any advice on how to like deal with that burnout, because you know, as a, like in especially in a movement like ours, it's continuously going.
Yeah.
And so we continuously have to keep going. And so constantly being burnt out is kind of hard. So I was wondering if you would have like any advice on how to deal with that.
That's true.
One thing that we're experiencing is that, well, one, people are individually getting burned out, but we're kind of taking turns getting so burned out that we can't do anything.
Yeah.
And then because people are so burned out that they can't do anything, then the people who can do things are doing more work, and then they get so burned out.
Yeah.
And we have like this cycle going. So yeah, I would like your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah. I mean, I can relate. We're experiencing the same thing in different spaces. And, you know, I don't want to say that I'm actually practicing what I'm saying because I'm not, but ideally, you know, this is going to go on for the long haul. Like this is not going to just end tomorrow. You know, it could even go on for our lifetimes. And so I think there are tools out there that we could rely on, but we're not. So for example, first of all, you know, community accountability practices, restorative justice practices that we can bring into our organizing spaces. There are so many resources, you know, out there. I could recommend books or, you know, if you want, where our movements, our organizations can actually be real about the harm that that many of us have been enduring in our movement spaces. And it's not a distraction, you know, it's not a waste of time. I'm trying to think of this example. There was a recent example where I hesitated before bringing something up because it could be seen as a distraction, you know, that kind of thing. And then I'm like, no, this is not a distraction. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that's another thing, is to shift the way we think about what we are allowed to prioritize in our organizations. You know, it's like, no, like making sure all of us are okay, and, you know, challenging sexism and homophobia in our movement spaces is equally important as all the other work. So I think that's another one. So the restorative justice would be to respond to your question, right, about the burnout. I was actually using that to respond to the burnout, because it would be like the first thing to do would be like accountability process around these questions of why are some people doing more work than others, and how to call people in rather than call people out, and use these conversations as a way to like grow people's relationships with each other and move through these tensions. Because what happens is if you don't do that, then everyone starts like, you know, gossiping, and all these rifts happen. And then there's like a bad guy and a good guy, or a good person and a bad person. And none of that is gonna, you know, we need to think about the larger reason we're here, you know? And the reality is that is the hardest work. the most difficult work that everyone wants to avoid is looking inwards and having difficult conversations with each other. And we're going to have to learn how to do it. We're going to have to learn how to have these conversations with each other, even if they're difficult.
And Will's right there.
Yeah, Will.
Yeah?
Like
Okay, is that a restorative justice person?
Yeah, yeah.
All right, there
Has
you
taught
go.
us
There's a
so
resource.
much, actually,
Okay,
about
that's
how to do
amazing.
this.
That's
And
amazing.
yeah, so really, and I will admit that it doesn't come naturally to me.
Yeah.
So I also have learned a lot from Will on this. I think it's good, like, if I can understand so it's basically like to think about the work we do in social movements, the work we do for Palestine right now and in solidarity and towards the liberation of Palestine, is that activism doesn't exist outside the world, right? So through our activism, we also are building the worlds we want through actually how we do our activism.
Yes.
And I think sometimes we forget that and we turn it into a sort of, this is activism about how to change the world. And then we reproduce so much of what we don't like about the world. Yeah. Is it?
Yeah.
Okay. So everybody,
Nice.
like, get your things if you are fasting.
Nice.
I think should I get the food from outside also? Okay, I'll bring it in.